Greetings, everybody, and welcome along to the latest live stream. And it's another interesting one tonight, and we're going to be discussing something very specific with regard to the ongoing events in Ukraine, and something that could best be described as, well, it's an origin story, really, for the events in Ukraine. And I'm going to be getting to that in just a moment, but it relates to things I've talked about before. And first of all, I will check in with everybody in the chat so far, just to see who we've got. Hello to Red Star Betty up there in the northeast. Hello to Irish Partisan, our man in Minsk. Hello to Steve Sweeney. I think you're referring to increased shelling of Donetsk today, Steve. Hope you're keeping well over there. Hello to Paul Charo. Hello to Will Johnson. Hello to Zuleika. Hello to Kent. Hello to DE. And okay, apparently we're all sound. Hello to Alan over there in Oakland, California. So, can you all hear me okay? If you can't, let me know. Right. I will begin then with a brief interlude, following up on something I said the other day, which is that the nature of fascism is profoundly anti-national, in contrast to all its rather grandiose claims and appeals to crass romanticism. And I want to say that to start off with, because what I'm about to talk to with regard to Ukraine is directly related to fascism. And what I mean by anti-national is that the essence of a nation, the real content of a nation is the masses. The real content of any nation is the proletariat, the peasantry, if such a class exists in any particular nation, and to the petty bourgeoisie to an extent as well. But overwhelmingly, it's the proletariat and the peasantry. And that is what constitutes a nation, and that is the future of the nation, any nation. And therefore, any political movement that arises which seeks to hurl a nation back into being ruled by the current capitalist class, the comprador bourgeoisie, the wretched set of traitors and placemen who are the servants of the imperialists. Any movement or party that says or stands for that and wants to subjugate the proletariat, to restore the profitability of capital and subjugate the peasantry as well, anything that wants to do that is not only, of course, anti-worker, but it's also anti-national by definition, because what they're doing is they are hurling the nation, the great masses of the nation, back into submission, into subjugation, either under the boot heel of a dictatorship which is there to prop up a decaying mode of production in the form of capitalism, or to subjugate the proletariat on behalf of the imperialists. And that is what I mean by anti-national. And that is why, of course, fascism in all its many different varieties has to appeal to romanticism, to, shall we say, an imagined heroic past, to an imagined heroic elite which don't exist, to a great faith-based crusade, again based on mythology. Fascism is, of course, something which is predominantly in the past been an appeal directed at the petty bourgeoisie, who are, of course, a class which bounce between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and their political tendencies reflect that. And I would say also that the whole essence of fascism in that pre-World War II interwar era, whether it's Mussolini, whether it's Hitler, whether it's Franco, all appealing to these mythical ideas of the nation, all in actual fact profoundly anti-national. Because, of course, what Mussolini wanted to do was he was dressing up his blatant service to the Italian bourgeoisie, the rotten and wretched Italian bourgeoisie, who having had the nation unified by the revolutionary nationalism of Garibaldi and Mazzini, were then only partially able to fully complete the unification of the nation and left large chunks of the nation underdeveloped. And when the workers and peasants started to rise, they turned to Mussolini's thug squads in order to deliver the nation back firmly into their hands, of course. Mussolini then spends 20 odd years trying various failed schemes to develop the productive forces further by hyper-exploiting the proletariat and the peasantry, privatizes large amounts of state assets, and then ultimately can only just about scrape out a victory in one imperialist war against the Abyssinians, now Ethiopia, and he had to use poison gas on them, then loses every war that he fights, fundamentally reflecting the unstable nature of his regime and also the decayed and rotten state of Italian capitalism. Hitler, of course, the notorious National Socialist, who libertarians have been saying is a socialist ever since then. You read anything that Hitler actually said, he's pretty clear on why they chose the name and also what it actually meant. Hitler is very clear that it's all his socialism is all based on essentially German mythology, and it's all about tying the proletariat and the peasantry to the German ruling class under the banner of this mythical German Volk. And this is what, of course, was the justification for all the things that Hitler actually got busy with, which is, of course, restoring the profitability of German capitalism by destroying all the institutions through which the proletariat used to politically and industrially find representation, and reducing the proletariat to borderline slave status in the factories under militarily imposed discipline. And, of course, again, privatizing large amounts of state assets, and handing over large areas of state operations to be run by the corporations under the fake banner of things like the German Labour Front, which, just as Mussolini did with these corporations, was all meant to be about unifying labour and capital, but was in actual fact about firmly establishing or re-establishing the dictatorship of capital over labour. And as for Franco, the great leader of the new Reconquista, of course, he killed plenty of workers, killed plenty of trade unionists, killed a lot of communists, and ultimately delivered Spain into the hands of the American bloc, where it has served as a loyal asset ever since. So fascism, waving its flag, screaming its mythologies, screaming its obscenities, what is it really all about when it comes down to it? Smashing and destroying the bargaining power and the political forces of the great masses of the nation in order to preserve the most parasitic, the most backward and the most rotten parts of the nation. That is fascism. And it's true whether it's the European fascists of the 30s, whether it's a character like Pinochet, or whether it's the Banderists in Ukraine today. Just look at what they have delivered Ukraine into. It's a slaughterhouse. It's a unending bloodletting that has gone on, as Steve says in the comments there, for 9 years. And that is what the great heroes of Ukrainian nationalism have delivered, just as 90 years ago these people were purely the advent of imperialism, albeit that sometimes they're in the service of British imperialism, sometimes they're in the service of German imperialism, now they're just men in the service of American imperialism. And in the service of that imperial master, they were prepared to deliver Ukraine into the hell of German occupation and slavery and slaughter in the 40s. And now they're delivering Ukraine into slaughter and ownership by BlackRock and the various agencies of American imperialism in the 2020s. It is an unending horror designed only to prop up the most foul and parasitic elements of any nation. That is what fascism is. And so you can find no more anti-national force than a fascist, which is why he has to shout and scream so loud and get so hysterical and resort to such violence, because they're trying to deny an awful lot of objective truth. And with that opening salvo out of the way, I will then move to the meat of the issue, so to speak, which is this, if you've not seen it so far. And this is a very well-researched report put together by a Ukrainian political scientist who works in Canada by the name of Ivan Katchanovski. And from the reading I've done, reading through this report and some other things he's written, he seems to be of a broadly liberal persuasion. And what is clear, though, is that he is an honest man and a fair man, in spite of his politics. And he has done a very thorough examination of an event that was absolutely crucial in terms of the development of the coup against Yanukovych in 2014, and ultimately the decision by the Donbass republics to try to gain autonomy from Ukraine following this incident, and then having to secede entirely, and then having to spend an awful long time trying to persuade the Russian Federation that actually they should intervene. And this all, well, one beginning is, of course, the 20th of February 2014, 9 years ago now, when, of course, there was the demonstrations which were supposedly triggered by Yanukovych's refusal to sign an EU accession agreement. And one of the things we should talk about in the future is the level of extreme delusion and illusion regarding the European Union and what it stands for amongst many populations, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, and of course in Britain as well. Excuse me while I slurp the tea there. So the decision by Yanukovych not to sign that EU accession agreement, which, by the way, was filled with absolutely horrific conditions for the Ukrainian working class, including the ending of subsidized heating for their houses, including the end of subsidies for accommodation, basically the final destruction of all elements of the post-Soviet legacy, or the remaining elements of the economic setup of the old Soviet Union that had survived through the 90s and the 2000s. The EU was essentially demanding the removal of all of them, which is, of course, what the parasitic and rotten Ukrainian ruling class wanted. So they, of course, responded to Yanukovych refusing to essentially consign the nation into perpetual servitude to the American-led bloc. And even though Yanukovych, of course, is no hero here, he's a man who had played his part in the dirty game of Ukrainian bourgeois politics as well. But he wanted to retain an equidistance between Russia and the American bloc. Essentially, he wanted to be able to negotiate with both. And he discovered, to his cost and to the cost of his nation in the end, that that is indeed impossible. And in this he joined many other people who had fought to do the same thing, including Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, including Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And you could add to that Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and even signing a deal with the imperialists wasn't enough to save him when they decided it was time to loot Libya. So Yanukovych makes the classic mistake in thinking that he can bargain with the imperialists, that they're prepared to settle for neutrality. And he really should have learnt from 2004 that they weren't even prepared to settle for that. But things reach a head and a crisis point on February the 20th of 2014, when the crowds that were assembled in Maidan Square in Kiev came under fire from what were reported at the time to be police snipers from a special agency of the Ukrainian police force in the pre-Maidan era called the Berkut force. And 49 people were killed and 157 wounded. Now, the story that was put out at the time, and that was relentlessly amplified across the usual suspects, BBC, CNN, and the various other imperialist news platforms, was that Yanukovych had ordered this massacre. He'd ordered the special police units to go and open fire on the demonstrators. And then when this didn't work, when this failed to disperse them, Yanukovych then fled, effectively resigning the presidency, and fled to his paymasters in Russia. Ironically enough, of course, Yanukovych's actual relationship with the Russians was a sometimes rather strained one, but reality never intrudes on these things. So that was the story, that Yanukovych, in a mad attempt to disperse this demonstration, ordered his police units to open fire on it, killing 49 people and wounding many more. And Katchanovski's report goes into great detail outlining why this is not the case. And in actual fact, that there was a lot more going on, and it was the result largely of a provocation that was staged by ultra right-wing forces who are ultimately allied with our old friends in the CIA and MI6. Now, Katchanovski doesn't say that in his report. That's my editorializing, because if you look at the history of the far-right forces, the various fascist organizations that exist in Ukraine, you'll find ultimately that the parent organization of them came out of the United States. As I've explained before, the history of Ukrainian fascism is, of course, one of it being endlessly in service to one imperial master or another. And of course, when the German imperial master was defeated in 1945, the Allied forces, that is the British and the Americans, sponsor the long-running West Ukrainian insurgency run by the Banderists for 7 years at least after the end of World War II, which kills many more thousands of people. And something I didn't know about, considering myself something of a student of history, but I didn't know about it until the special military operation began last year, when it came up through other research that I was doing. But following the defeat of the Banderists by the Soviet forces and the very well justified killing of Bandera himself in the 1950s, the various fascist organizations that had been defeated in Ukraine fled out of Europe mostly, though some did end up over here in Britain, but mostly they ended up in the United States and Canada. And it is there that they were maintained as assets of the largely American intelligence operations, but the Canadians were involved in this as well. And they were funded and kept going for many, many years until, of course, thanks to the treacherous and buffoonish Gorbachev, the Soviet Union imploded and finally ripped apart in the shabby deal done by Yeltsin and Kravchuk at the end of 1991. And after 1991 and the establishment of independent Ukraine, or the newly independent capitalist Ukraine, the United States and the British and the Canadians used this as an opportunity to move those networks, those fascist organizations that they'd been maintaining for almost half a century, to unleash them inside Ukraine in order that they could firmly start the process of making sure that Ukraine gravitated relentlessly back towards the NATO bloc. As covered many times before, this was all part of a concerted plan that was outlined outlined openly by the Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney gang in 1992 in their original memorandum about the need to break up Russia. And the policy has not changed since then, to quote Putin again. And this is the necessary context to examine what happened in Maidan Square on the 20th of February 2014, because you have what is in essence an international operation, which is on the ground run by Ukrainian fascists, but also includes Georgian fascists and various other characters who are paid to be there by somebody, either Ukrainian oligarchs or other interested parties. And one of the cases that Katchanovski makes is that there's credible evidence that a Georgian sniper team, some of the members of which are now fighting in the Georgian Legion over there in eastern Ukraine / Western Russia, and are still active to this day. And it was them who was part of the team that was doing the shooting, and that it was actually shooting that was conducted from a hotel on the square that was actually occupied by far-right Ukrainian forces at the time. So what they found when they examined the 49 people who had been killed, and these were mostly demonstrators that were killed. So these far-rightists and these fascists were shooting people who were nominally at least on their own side. And they shot a number of police officers as well, but mostly it was demonstrators, and most of the wounded were demonstrators as well. And so this is what actually went on. That the Euromaidan, so to speak, was the start of this, but they needed something more. The people running this operation needed not just to have a deal with Yanukovych where he agreed to early elections and effectively to step down. They needed a full coup. Because if Yanukovych steps down and there's new elections, well, Yanukovych's party of the regions could well win those elections. And therefore, these people are back to square one. And what was going on at the time was, of course, that Putin was attempting, as he often does, or did until quite recently, to find a way to get a bargain going, to negotiate with Obama and the US imperialists to reach an end to the conflict that was threatening to, and indeed did, spill over into a full-on war in Ukraine in the end. And they thought they had some kind of deal. Putin mentions this and has mentioned it repeatedly. He mentioned it recently in his meeting with the war correspondents in the Kremlin, and he mentioned it also a while ago back in the interviews that he did with the American film director Oliver Stone, which if you've not watched those interviews yet, there's 3 of them. I think they're about hour-long films, so 3 hours in total. Go and find those and watch them because it's a very interesting interview, if only to see that Putin, if anything, is nothing if not completely consistent in all the political positions that he does actually take. And of course, to realize very quickly that the man understands English perfectly because he routinely beats his translator to the punch when replying to Stone's questions. Point about this is that Putin says in those interviews with Stone that they had a deal whereby Yanukovych essentially had agreed to step down and agreed to early elections. So he was already a lame duck. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough for the people organizing this thing. They didn't want new elections. The only new elections they were prepared to countenance were ones where the party of the regions, Yanukovych's party, which used to be strong, particularly in East Ukraine, the areas that, Steve's in now, and also around Kharkov and other Russian-speaking areas, but also the Ukrainian Communist Party, the first target for any fascist rising, any fascist coup. And so they needed not just Yanukovych to go, not just elections, but they needed the whole system of government that was there to be overthrown and replaced with something else, and for a number of parties to be banned, and only pro-US parties, shall we say, pro-fascist parties to be allowed to stand. And this is what they needed. So this took a form of 2 parts. And first was the deliberate inflaming of tensions further by sponsoring this massacre in the square, killing 49 people, wounding 157 others. And then, following on from that, when Yanukovych was trying to rally his own forces over in Kharkov, was to stage several attempts on Yanukovych's life, which is ultimately, as Putin said, why Yanukovych quit the country, because he was convinced that if he stayed there, he would be killed. And indeed, as Katchanovski notes in his report, when Yanukovych was trying to get over to Kharkov, he was warned, because he was flying by helicopter, by the air traffic control in Kharkov, that an instruction had come from Kiev to shoot his aircraft down, obviously killing him in the process, and that his motorcade was fired upon, and there were many attempts on his life before he eventually was literally driven out of the country and sought refuge in the only place he possibly could, which is in the Russian Federation. So this is what is going on here. The deal that Putin talks about that was clearly not something that the American forces were going to accept. Now, did this mean that Obama himself was conniving in this? Well, you never know. That man's got more faces than 50 Yanuses. But certainly the forces in what you might call the American permanent state, the American deep state, call it what you will. The intelligence services, the permanent state hacks like Newland and others that seem to hang around for decade after decade after decade. The physical embodiments, shall we say, of the American imperial system, those people were certainly never going to accept it. And they certainly weren't going to lean on their proxies, people like Andrei Parubi and others, other noted Ukrainian far-rightists, who they had been, of course, sponsoring for many, many decades. They weren't going to pressure them to accept such a deal. Remember, they had been stymied somewhat in 2004 when they thought they'd got their man Yushchenko in and that he was going to deliver them what they wanted, and he turned out to be rather useless and couldn't quite pull it off. So now they were leaving nothing to chance. And one of the other things that Katchanovski mentions here is that, of course, this was something that was inspired by the events that took place in Romania in 1989. And this is a now documented case of false flag sniper attacks conducted by the very people who came to power in Romania once they'd murdered Ceausescu. And I did do a podcast on this a while ago, so I will just refresh people's memories if they require it. In 1989, of course, the various counter-revolutions were underway across Central and Eastern Europe in the old people's democracies. Now, mostly these passed off, if not without incident, then fairly quickly, because the majority of the revisionists in the old communist parties and the state apparatus just changed sides or gave up and ran away. And the states just imploded because revisionism had rotted them all. Now, in fairness to Nicolae Ceausescu, who was indeed a revisionist, but he was also not a coward. The man, when facing a firing squad, went to his death whistling the International. Can't say fairer than that. But he decided he wasn't going to quit. So they needed to do something to essentially up the ante, to make Ceausescu flee, to destabilize things further. And so the people who ultimately came to power in Romania shot from tall buildings the crowd of demonstrators that was in Bucharest in 1989. They shot several people, and then also somebody or another took a lot of bodies out of the morgue in Bucharest and left them around the place to make it look as if even more people had been killed. And this was actually subject to a criminal trial in Romania in 2018, when almost 30 years after the events, several people who were still alive, who had been involved in that, were finally brought to trial and found guilty of murder. And so the overthrow of socialism in Romania, however compromised Ceausescu's version of it might have been, was facilitated by essentially a massacre conducted by counter-revolutionaries that could be pinned on Ceausescu. And this grotesque lie is what marked the end of the socialist period in Romania, a massacre carried out by counter-revolutionaries. And did they come up with that themselves? Well, maybe. It's perfectly possible. It's a fairly straightforward plan. But given the fact that this again happened with an international cast of characters in Ukraine in 2014, it's certainly a reasonable case to make that somebody else or other interested parties were involved in this, principally our old friends in the CIA, MI6, and other NATO intelligence agencies who have a long history of this kind of activity. So this is it's established fact that this is an operation that has been carried out before. It was carried out in Romania in 1989 for the specific purpose of inflaming the situation and destabilizing things further. And this is exactly what they wanted to achieve in Kiev in 2014. They wanted it to be not left a chance at all that any element of the old constitutional order in Ukraine could survive, and that it would not be left a chance that anybody other than their hand-picked people like Poroshenko were going to win the next elections. Now remember, the resignation of Yanukovych was essentially confirmed by a session of the Ukrainian parliament that was held at gunpoint. Various parties starting with the opposition Communist Party and then Yanukovych's Party of the Regions were banned, and the coup regime finally constituted itself anew as the new government, with ultimately Poroshenko serving as its first president. And remember, the other excerpt that we got, which was, of course, Victoria Nuland famously saying, well, fuck the EU. Well, turns out you didn't even really need to do that. They rolled over pretty quickly, because they always do. They are merely for the followers of American imperialism now. But the other thing Nuland was saying was that she was picking out a guy called Yatsenyuk, who was going to be the new head of government there, temporary head of government. And this is indeed exactly what happened. The US imperialists were picking people out to serve in the ministries. And so this was something that they very much were deeply involved in, and not even hidden, because you could see good old John McCain, the late unlamented John McCain, stood there on the stage saying, we are with you. And of course, Victoria Nuland handing out the cookies in the square, that kind of thing. So they were intimately involved in all of this right from the start. And this, the report from Katchanovski goes through various different pieces of evidence regarding the who was actually behind this massacre. And he comes up with several different people and examines the various pieces of evidence that come from the official Ukrainian investigation. And I didn't realize until I read this report, but the trial that was meant to be held for the Berkut police officers who were charged with conducting this massacre, this trial ultimately collapsed back in 2019 because even though some of these men had sought exile or sought safety in Donbass, they actually went back to Kiev to face trial and defend themselves. And the Ukrainian state, now under Zelensky, refused to go ahead with the prosecutions and in fact traded these men back in a prisoner exchange with the Donbass republics. So they didn't want that trial to go ahead. And Katchanovski outlines why. Because there's many different instances of evidence being changed, of testimonies being discarded. The actual physical evidence that was taken from the bodies of the dead clearly showed that they'd been shot at a high angle from buildings in around the protest that were occupied by Right Sector and Svoboda, two of the far-right organizations that were actually involved in the Maidan. So, and then you have the testimony of the Georgian mercenaries who had been taking part there and who were directly linked to, guess who? Our old friend Mikhail Saakashvili, the beneficiary of another color revolution against another fool in Georgia this time, another fool and legacy of the Gorbachev era, Eduard Shevardnadze, who, although a capitalist who'd made himself into a stooge of US imperialism, he wasn't quite enough of a stooge for US imperialism. So they conjured up the so-called Rose Revolution to get rid of him. Well, these Georgian guys who gave testimony that they had been part of a sniper team that had been operating in the tall buildings around the square where this was all carried out in 2014, they were linked directly to Saakashvili's political operation. And of course, Saakashvili ends up playing a political role, for at least for a while, in Ukraine, and even fancied himself the job of taking on the presidency of Ukraine for a while, until even they got sick of him and packed him off back to Georgia in the end, where he rots in jail now, quite deservedly so. So what you've got here is the physical evidence that these people weren't shot by the police at the ground level. They were shot at high angles with the bullets coming down from, of course, high positions around the square. The original autopsies and gathering of evidence from the bodies showed that the ammunition that was used was not the standard ammunition that was issued to the Ukrainian police force as they were constituted at the time. There's also a lot of witness testimonies, even from people who were part of the Euromaidan demonstrations, stating that the firing that killed those people was not coming from the Ukrainian police. It was coming from high buildings around them. It's coming down onto them, not what happened in terms of the actions of the Ukrainian police, who indeed did fire, but they were firing largely over the heads of the crowd. And that was also proved in the original investigation, according to Katchanovski, because they recovered the bullets from the telegraph poles that have now, of course, been cut down in Kiev, apparently. And it's confirmed that the firing that the police were doing was not at people, it was warning shots over their heads. And the killing was all done by these snipers, who, many of whom, these Georgian guys who, when they popped up and were caught in Belarus, did provide testimony as to exactly what they were doing. So this is now pretty much nailed on, I would say, by Katchanovski's work. He takes an awful lot of his evidence from the official witness testimonies from the actual investigation by the Ukrainian authorities that was carried out and then, of course, either not presented at these trials. These trials were then, of course, never concluded. And some of the witness testimony was then pressured into being changed. But even imperialist press at the time recorded that the shots were coming from high up in these buildings that were all controlled, as Katchanovski outlines, by various far-right Ukrainian organizations. Ukrainian far-right organizations that were supposedly on side with the Maidan movement, but who were more than happy to employ the services of Georgian mercenaries to carry out these massacres. So it now is absolutely clear, if once you read this document, which you can get on the website Brill Publishing, he's put it on there. You can download it for nothing. It's only about 50 pages long. You can read the whole thing in about a couple of hours at the very most. So it's pretty much as certain as we can get it that the massacre that actually caused ultimately Yanukovych to have to flee was something that was a setup. It was set up by the pro-Maidan forces. It was carried out by far-right organizations who are intimately linked to the intelligence services of the United States and of Britain. And it was something that was carried out either with their knowledge or their direct involvement, I would say. That's my conclusion. Not Katchanovski doesn't go that far in his conclusion. And that the deal that Putin thought he had with Obama was immediately cancelled out by this, and that this was followed up by concerted attempts to kill Yanukovych until, of course, he quit the country and had to flee into exile in Russia. And even though Yanukovych is a deeply corrupt guy, stole God knows how much from the Ukrainian treasury and had a well-appointed mansion with apparently golden toilets in it, for all that he is part of the problem in bourgeois Ukrainian politics, the fact is that what followed him was so much more and infinitely worse. Had Yanukovych actually managed to succeed in securing better relations with the Russian Federation, then who knows? We might have been in a better position today. But I don't think that the imperialists and their servants in Ukraine were going to stop until, of course, Ukraine was either dragged into the status that it is now, a puppet regime run for the benefit of US imperialism, or that they'd reduce the country to rubble. And that's why I say that there's nobody more anti-national than a fascist. Because look at what these people have done to Ukraine in the 9 years since they got their hands on it. And that is exactly what they would do to anywhere else they get hold of. I mean, look at what they've done in Georgia. Even though the Saakashvili regime was removed, they've essentially, his successors haven't been much better in the fact that it's been a relentless war upon the Georgian working class for the benefit of the profit of imperialist organizations, mainly American corporations and European corporations who go over there to super exploit the labor of the Georgian working class. And it makes you appreciate even a character like who, when I was a Trotskyite, I would dismiss routinely, somebody like Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. Like you look at the status of Belarus now, even though they were ultimately forced into a closer alliance with the Russian Federation, you can't argue that Lukashenko is Putin's puppet. If anything, like his status seems to be pretty well respected by the Russian authorities within the constitutional arrangements of the Union state. But in terms of what that guy was able to do, or more to the point, what the Belarusians were able to do to save their country from the fate of Ukraine that has befallen Ukraine, that has befallen, of course, the countries of Yugoslavia, the deindustrialization and asset stripping that was carried out in the Baltic states, the fate of Georgia. You look at all that and you think that, well, Lukashenko, whatever drawbacks that man may have, and I'm sure there are many, he managed to steer the Belarusian nation away from that. And if only Ukraine had had somebody of similar skills, to be blunt, or with a similar support base who could have carried out that kind of, shall we say, successful progressive Bonapartist rule, because the only way you were going to stop what the American imperial puppets in the form of right sector, Svoboda, the other forms of banderism that exist in Ukraine, was to be quite blunt about it, to suppress them out of existence, to ban their organizations and to force them out of the country. And if somebody had managed to do that in Ukraine in the 1990s, well, Ukraine would certainly be in a better position today. So I would encourage everybody to read Katchanovski's report. Again, you can get through it in a couple of hours. It confirms all your worst suspicions that you might have about the activities of these people and who they're working for. And if you're reading it with a Marxist frame of mind, it can certainly enhance your knowledge of just how far the Americans and their puppet organizations are prepared to go. And this is, of course, isn't the first massacre that they've carried out in recent years, which they've tried to pin on their enemies. And remember all the faked chemical attacks in Syria, which, because they wanted to stage it very well, resulted in very real casualties of Syrian people. The endless provocations they engage in anywhere in the world, which involves a lot of very real death and destruction in order to get what they want, which is, of course, the looting and the plundering of a nation. And if the nation gets destroyed and millions die, well, these people don't care for a moment. Just as they wouldn't care for a moment if millions of people in our own countries died. Not for a second. They wouldn't blink. Wouldn't make them blink. They are no better, these people, in terms of their blatant disregard and their often barely disguised loathing for anybody in the working class, or even anybody in the petty bourgeoisie who gets in their way. These people have the same attitude towards us as the likes of the Duke of Wellington did 200 years ago, who was happy to send his soldiery marching boldly into the cannon fire of Napoleon in order to defend his estate and his privileges back at home. And in 200 years, the British ruling class and their extensions in the American ruling class haven't changed. They would consign all of us to the flames in order to stay in power for another second. So they wouldn't think twice about consigning the nation of Ukraine to the flames as well. So this is the first thing I wanted to talk to you about tonight. Be sure to read the report and be sure to spread it around on social media as well, wherever you can, because everybody should read this, because this is one of the central lies regarding this whole affair. And it's brilliantly debunked in this particular paper. So I'll pause now for questions and comments. I believe we've got various others. We've got a discussion about British regional accents there. Apparently Google doesn't provide people with alerts for the live stream. If you've subscribed to the channel, I believe what you have to do is to click on the bell next to the subscribe button and sign up to all alerts. They've made it as complicated as possible. Hello to Ash in Melbourne. Oswhistle says, in my opinion, it's the USA that needs to get broken up. Well, I would slightly disagree there. I'd say that the USA needs a proletarian revolution. It needs the current selection of scum to be overthrown by the American working class and for socialism to come to America. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this. Newland is going to be forever remembered as the Maidan Maiden. Well, I mean, that's far too charitable a title for her, Slava, to be honest. I'm surprised Katchanovski was able to publish his work. Well, I am as well. I'm amazed that this has even come out, to be blunt about it. I mean, I think the fact that Katchanovski is a pro-EU liberal maybe helps him do it, but the fact that Brill has gone out there and put it out into the open, well, we should be using this opportunity to spread this as far as we possibly can. Of course, we disagree with Katchanovski's political conclusions, but it's an honest piece of reporting that we should highlight. But yeah, you're right, Slava. I am surprised he was able to publish it. Newland will be forever remembered as the Widowmaker, says Irish Partisan. Yeah, looks like it and all. Katchanovski and Lukashenko are great. Agreed. CL4SYR, this is James Graham, has more on that. He won a root claim prize for Guta 2013 false flag. Yeah, another false flag attack. I think you're referring to one in Syria there. Irish Partisan says same happened in Kosovo in Racak, where Yugoslav People's Army were blamed for massacring civilians. The event was built up to provide the context for NATO's attack on Yugoslavia. Yeah, and another thing I read about recently was that there were, if anybody's old enough to remember the war in Yugoslavia, it's the first one I can clearly remember. I remember the bombing of a refugee column, which was actually done by NATO aircraft and was blamed on the Yugoslav army, even though it came out very quickly that it was done by NATO. And then they said it was an accident, and then later it came out that the pilot was ordered to carry it out. So again, and also with connected to this, but slightly different from false flags, is the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was something that was, well, they said at the time it was an accident, but there's no way that they could possibly not know where all the major embassies were in Belgrade. And that the speculation that I've heard from people, including friend of the show Kit Clarenberg, is that the Chinese were providing some assistance in terms of signals assistance to the Yugoslavs from a transmitter in their basement of their embassy. So the Americans blew it up basically as a warning shot to the Chinese. Chinese don't appear to have forgotten about that, though, even though the Americans really wished they had. So this is the reality of U.S. imperialism, which is that it is everything it presents to us about its interventions is a lie, is a wildly over-exaggerated piece of fiction. And everything they say about their humanitarian interventions, about their endless wars, about their good intentions, all of this is lies. Like, if you consider that there's now evidence that that NATO ordered that pilot to blow up that refugee column, well, why would they do that? Given that you could see pretty clearly, given the very good visuals you can now have from, even at the time, 24 years ago, that you could have from a jet from one of the NATO countries. You could tell that that was a refugee column, yet they were told to blow it up. Why? Well, just increases the stories you could put out about the horrendous massacres carried out by the Serbs. This is all the work of the people who wish to turn all of this stuff into propaganda, even if later they had to admit that it was the work done by somebody else, that it wasn't that it was done by them by accident. They've already got 2 news cycles out of a story about the horrible Serbs massacring people, when in actual fact it was the NATO forces that did it. So the fact that the Katchanovskis produced this is something that we need to highlight, and need to keep highlighting it as well, because they're going to try something else. There's always something else that they will try and do, that another fake out that they will try and pull off. They tried one, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago when Marco Rubio was dancing around like a lunatic on the border of Colombia and Venezuela, trying to send what he said was 2 trucks of humanitarian aid into Venezuela, and then it ended up with his own guys burning them or something. Again, like, they try and stage these provocations, these staged events, which are then amplified by their media all the time. And the good thing about living in our current era is that at least the alternative, the truth, shall we say, can get around, even though it's suppressed, even though it's often buried. It does get out there, so to speak. So that's something that I wanted to highlight, something which everybody should take a look at. The other thing I wanted just to close on was the Nigel Farage debanking scandal, which is something which has popped up in Britain recently. And you may not be familiar with it if you live outside of perfidious Albion, but I wanted to highlight it because it's very much something which is a sign of things to come. Now, if you're familiar with the history of the British banking system and its usage against the trade union movement, this isn't anything particularly new, though, of course, now it's much easier to do to people en masse. Back in the 1980s, the National Union of Mine Workers had its bank accounts severely restricted. They attempted to confiscate the money that people had sent to the NUM when it was out on strike for a year. They attempted to do what they call a sequestration of assets, stop them using the banking system. They ended up having to drive briefcases full of cash around to make sure the union's operating expenses got met. So this is something that they've always had the power to do, only now with cash being used less and less, and with the banking system more digitized, it's easier to essentially debank somebody. And if you're not familiar with what's gone on, Nigel Farage, most of you will probably know of him. He's the guy who is associated most heavily with the Brexit vote. He led the UK Independence Party, this pro-Brexit, essentially sort of an odd coalition of like old school Tories, libertarians, various sort of dissident right-wing sorts in Britain who wanted to stage a vote in order to campaign for withdrawal from the EU. And after years, over 20 years of campaigning for this, they finally got to the point where they were strong enough to provoke a split, or looking like they were going to provoke a split in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, prompting the opportunistic Prime Minister David Cameron to overpromise. He promised a referendum if these guys stayed in the party and didn't defect to UKIP just before the 2015 election. And then he delivered on that referendum and lost, because people used it as an opportunity to vote against the system. And ever since then, there's been a lot of manoeuvres by various actors who are linked to the British deep state to try and nail Farage for some criminal activity or another. Again, friend of the show, Kit Clarenberg, has reported on this extensively. The attempt by The Guardian and Carol Cadwallader, who's linked to the Integrity Initiative, to smear Farage, to claim that he was a Russian asset, to claim that him and Aaron Banks, this admittedly shady cadwallader who's one of the bankrollers of UKIP, to claim that they were on the payroll of the Russians, which wasn't true. And Cadwallader ended up losing that case. But the allegations of Russian involvement, of foreign interference in Brexit, just like in the United States with Trump, is a similar thing that went on in both cases. Like the liberals, the liberal end of the bourgeoisie basically went completely nuts and decided they were going to move heaven and earth to remove these negative impacts as they saw it. Corbyn, slightly different matter, and I've started talking about him. I'll be here all day. But with Farage, this has concluded recently with this debanking scandal, which he claimed in a Twitter video released a couple of weeks back that he'd had his accounts removed from Coutts, which is this bank that provides services to the ultra-rich. I think it's ultimately owned by the NatWest Group. And he claimed that this had been done under an EU regulation about him being a politically exposed person, which relates or seems to relate to, the allegations that he was in bed with the Russians. And first of all, the bank management denied it, and then the owner, the company that owns Coutts, NatWest Group, denied it. But then, of course, Farage had decent lawyers on the case and managed to unearth a lot of documents where it was confirmed that he'd essentially been denied an account, or he had his account closed by Coutts for specifically political reasons, mentioning his support for Brexit, his association with Trump, and a couple of other things as well. And this was now fairly well established and documented that the bank had been lying, and there was political reasons as to why they'd done this. Of course, the Tories, the Conservative Party government, screamed that this was terrible and that we're going to do something about it. Whether they do or not, we should keep track of that. But the reaction that's been most interesting has, of course, been the moronic British left. And when I don't even need to add the word moronic anymore. When I say British left, or indeed American left, you can just assume moronic is just added into the description automatically, because they've been like celebrating it and laughing about it. And of course, what these clowns don't realize is that if they'll do this to Farage, who's like a supporter of British imperialism, he just wants it to be run in the more traditional sense of the term, not this ghastly collaboration with the Europeans. If they'll do it to him, who's a very establishment guy, who's got some very powerful friends, so if they'll do it to a guy like that who does have millions in the bank, or did do, who does have powerful friends, who does have access to a team of top-rate lawyers, well, what the hell are they going to do to, shall we say, a group of trade unionists who go on an unofficial strike, who are trying to keep their heads above water by crowdfunding themselves if their unions abandon them? Or even take it one step up. What if they decide to debank a trade union again? I mean, it took a lot of effort for the National Union of Mine Workers back in 84 to 85 to keep themselves running on cash. It'll be a lot more difficult these days, given how many places don't take cash, given how many people rely upon purely digital transactions. If you think that them being able to deny banking services to this guy because you have some fucking allergic reaction to Brexit, or you think that Nigel Farage is some sort of fascist, which he's not, by the way, he's basically he's basically an old English libertarian Tory. If you think that this is a good thing, this is clownish behaviour, because in the period we're moving into, where class struggle is going to intensify, where we might get more wildcat strikes that are abandoned by the union leadership, where we need to crowdfund people's strike funds or legal defence funds or any of that. Now they've established that they can do this. Admittedly, they've had to backtrack on Farage because he has enough powerful friends and media clout to make them back down. But how many of us are going to be able to make them back down when we're in a more severe class war situation, where they suddenly turn around and deny you banking services, plunging many people who might be involved in a strike or a difficult political struggle into an immediate crisis? Have any of these idiots celebrating the debanking of Farage thought about this for more than 5 seconds, for more than the visceral, silly thrill of giggling at the bad man? Who, by the way, like, as far as villains go, I mean, who's worse, Nigel Farage or Tony Blair? You know, Nigel Farage, who says a few naughty things about immigrants, or Tony Blair, who's responsible for the killing of God knows how many millions. And yet, of course, the moronic British left in the 2000s was telling you to vote for Tony Blair's Labour Party to stop fascism, as they will do today as well. So bear that in mind as well. So this is another case where the left has managed to, quite frankly, get all the wrong conclusions yet again. And again, Zuleika has pointed out in the chat that they were doing this to independent journalists last year. Another thing I should have mentioned is that they tried this out on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks over a decade ago, when suddenly PayPal and the other major financial organizations, PayPal, by the way, founded by Elon Musk, suddenly withdrew services from WikiLeaks under pressure from the American government. So just because this is now happening to Farage, who attracts the ire of the British left, because the British left just follows the bourgeois liberals in their moral panics, this is going to happen to independent journalists, it's going to happen to trade unionists, it's going to happen to communists. And, well, if you don't want it to happen to you, well, you better have a pretty solid plan of action for when they do deny you banking services, and basically and they won't even give you the time, if things have really heated up, to get your money out of there. They'll just take it off you. And they'll claim that they've taken it off you because you're suspected of terrorist activities, which, by the way, they can do. They can take your assets off you if they suspect you of terrorism. Under the powers of the terrorism acts that they've passed quite a few of over the last 20 years, they can do almost anything to you if they can claim you're a terrorist. They can take your children away from you. They can get you fired from your job. They can throw you in prison without charge. All of that is stuff that they've been establishing that they can do legally for many, many years now. And of course, every single time this happened, you get some moron saying, well, if you don't done nothing wrong, it's nothing to fear, or no, they're just doing it to bad people. Well, look where we are now, on the verge of a catastrophic economic crisis, on the verge of outbursts of new political struggles, and the moronic left is still cheering this on. It's a warning for all of us of the kind of treatment that they've got in store for us as time goes on. Right. They were doing this to independent journalists last year for reporting on Ukraine, says Zuleika. Very true. Irish Partisan mentions Julian Assange. Yes. Oswittle says money is not value, it is claims on value, with banks meddling with accounts. The validity of the claims is eroded along with the currency itself. Well, yes, of course. I promised to pay the pair on demand the sum of £5. One trick that might be neat is if we all turned up to the Bank of England and demanded the share of our currency in gold again, though I don't think they'll be paying out anytime soon. So yes, I've got to the top of the hour tonight. So that covers everything I wanted to mention on tonight's broadcast. I've had to jiggle things around slightly because I saw this report and wanted to cover that. So the Britain in Crisis update will go into tomorrow, and I'm going to put the latest Ukraine war update into Thursday's program. And then what I'll do is, because I'm traveling on Friday down to London, I'll be addressing a meeting on trade unionism and industrial struggle hosted by the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. I'll be there. That's in Southall on Saturday. So I'll be pre-recording the show on Mao's on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. I'll be pre-recording that for going out on Friday. If I can do something on Saturday whilst I'm on the move, I will do. But the next show after that would then be Sunday, and that'll be the Q&A show, probably in the evening when I get back from that London, as they call it. But until tomorrow, thank you for tuning in. I'll be back with you again in 24 hours from now. And I'll just thank everybody who's come along and contributed to the chat tonight. So that's thank you to Red Star Betty, Irish Partisan, Steve Sweeney out there in Donetsk, Paul Sharo, Will Johnson, Zuleika, Kent, D.E., Alan out there in California, David Jennings, Ash down there in Melbourne, Kai, and Oswhistles, James Graham, and Marko Vucevic, CJ over there in Richmond, Virginia. Hope you enjoyed the program. Okay, I think that's everybody, the roll call gone through. Thank you. Join me again tomorrow for another trip around the latest things out of Britain in Crisis, and there's a lot to get to. So I will be back again then. Thank you, and I will fade you back over to the appropriate music.
quality step from PSG. He's not gone on the tour of Japan. Obviously. Check! It's about debanking.
Я з Леніним стояв на барикадах, нас кликав революції гудок. Нескорених окопах Сталінграда вручав мені полковник фартбиток. З Леніним дорогами крутими добро і правду ніс в чужі світи. У полум'ї народи побратими планету врятували від біди. З Леніним в тривозі неспокої кував братерства сонячні мости. Вони